So, folks, we've got some interesting insights from the latest Hearthstone developer AMA. Lots of questions posed on Twitter to Iksar, and some really interesting responses. Like, we're probably going to get a new class again someday. There were things called champion cards that almost made it into the game and might still. And spells might have tribes in the future, like fire mage spells and ice mage spells actually labeled on the card. That could be a crazy thing. Some balance insights, potential nerfs, etc. Lots to talk about through this AMA. So let's go ahead and jump into these questions on Twitter. So Silent Storm asks, after seeing how Demon Hunter went, are there plans to add another new class to the game? And Iksar said, purely from a player metrics perspective, it seems like Demon Hunter was a success. There were a lot of variables, he says, and that was indeed a huge spike in Hearthstone, at least on my end. I know when Demon Hunter came out, but that was also COVID and new expansion hype and all kinds of various things. And he says it's hard to understand if the success was because players love having a new class because there was a higher marketing spend. Hey, there's another variable, etc. But overall, our team is positive on new classes and will probably do it again. It's just not something you want to be doing every year. We've talked about Death Knight, Monk, or even the idea of inventing something new. And that's actually what I've been talking about to you guys on stream when you asked this question is I want to see a new class, not something borrowed again from World of Warcraft, something like a bard. How cool would that be if it was like songs and buffs and all these crazy things inspiring your minions to do cool stuff? How would that look? What would that look like? What would that hero power be? I also talked about maybe a tinker class, like, kind of a gnome or goblin style mech base that might be a little bit too connected to mechs as a minion type, but could still be really cool to see what Hearthstone's vision for a World of Warcraft class could be. He says there is no new class in development today, and we work about a year ahead of schedule, so I wouldn't look out for it anytime soon. We set up a lot of infrastructure for adding a new class the first time around, though, so the turnaround would be a little easier. So I would say it's probably gonna be like 2 to 3 years before we'd see another class based on that, and that's kind of what we were saying anyway, but still something that would be super duper exciting. Demon Hunter, of course, came out the gate with some balance issues that wouldn't necessarily happen for all future classes. So I personally like just having more angles to approach the game and seeing what all these new designs could look like. So as long as I get the balance right, sign me up. So moving on over to this question, this was cool. Are tribal spells a win or an if? Basically spells with either existing minion types or totally new spell types like arcane, fire, etc. And Iksar says, another one we've talked about quite a bit. I will confidently put this in the win category. So this is something that more or less confirmed to be coming at some point. And here's my thought. Usually developers are really coy about this stuff unless something's coming in the pretty near future. And since Dean here is saying, hey, I think this is actually going to happen, that means to me that it might be happening sooner rather than later. Like it's already in the works, and maybe one of the expansions this year could introduce that sort of thing. So I don't know if that would be like a sweeping, like every spell gets a type, like all arcane mage spells get arcane and all fire get fire, etc. We've seen some like offhanded references to these sorts of things in the past. So like getting that actually formally in there, and then having things that's like, fire spell damage that only affects fire spells could be a cool way to help us define decks a little more interesting. And I'm sure there's 1,000 other better implementations, of course. I'm just shooting from the hip here, but that's really exciting. I would love to see what that looks like. That sounds cool. So this next one's pretty interesting. It's about a card type that almost made it into the game, it sounds like. They were talking about essentially here mechanics that work and don't, and Dean says they usually have about 3 to 10 in test, and only 1 to 2 mechanics will actually make it through. The most recent example I can think of is this concept of champion cards. They were minions that had a health value, no attack value, and an ability. They were like your commander on the battlefield, a mini hero. They used their ability every turn, but didn't directly attack, much like your hero. They weren't affected by things like Flame Strike, etc. So it sounds like, I don't know why they'd have health if they weren't necessarily infected by Flame Strike. Maybe they lived in like their own unique position on the board. But it sounds awesome, like an additional way to like almost an aura effect, but attached to some stats. They could really help you define what your deck does, and it'd be interesting to see. Kind of almost sounds like what happened with the spirits from Rosticon. They were like stealthed minions on board with an effect, but it sounds like this just takes it to a whole new level and would perhaps even be a unique card type like hero cards. This could be champion cards on top of that. There was some promise and excitement, but I don't think we got to a place with the abilities or the visuals that made us confident enough to move forward at the time. Might be something we revisit later. Oh, actually, here we go. It sounds as difficult to balance as Rossicon Spirits. And apparently Dean wasn't happy with the balance thoughts. And those were indeed pretty weak on average. Yeah, I would love to see that again. I think it's cool. I would love new card types. I thought hero cards were an awesome introduction. Again, some balance issues, of course, but I love having more different kinds of cards to play with. So that's another interesting development and evolution Hearthstone could take. Moving on, this one's kind of a crazy tease. A question asked about the Shaman hero power. And Iksar says, the fact that it's different because of those things being like the way it summons a random order and it limits itself to 4 isn't necessarily a negative, but we have discussed changing aspects of Shaman's hero power. When we looked at the classic set and ways to change it, we also looked at the base hero powers and what classes were supposed to be good and weak at. We'll have some more details on that in a big future update, but nothing to divulge just yet. That to me sounds like a soft confirmation that I think Shaman's hero power is probably going to get changed. We have more details on what that looks like. So, there's this big classic reset or rework thing being teased that we don't really know much about. It's just this kind of looming thing. And it sounds like even hero powers weren't off limits for those changes, which is just kind of nuts to think about because hero powers just feel so core to the game at this stage. But I'm not a big fan of Shaman's hero power either. It always just feels so awkward, and the RNG aspect of it doesn't usually feel very good. So I would be all about some changes to Shaman's hero power as long as it can retain, the feel, the identity of like totems and stuff, but just making it feel tighter and having better support package in Classic would be cool. So that's kind of crazy big news. Moving on here, this is a discussion on reprinting cards in Hearthstone and the idea of whether you could take an old design and put it in a new expansion just because it fits so well. And Dean says they really, really, really almost printed Web Spinner for Unguro. Web Spinner being from Naxxramas, it almost came back in Unguro. I think it turned into Jeweled Macaw instead, which has a very similar sort of design. But essentially says, they'd rather print a new card instead if they just, want a close kind of thing. And that they're not really worried about like running out of card ideas. So the need to go back and reprint stuff isn't necessary because there's always enough tweaks and changes to keep things moving forward without having to rely on old reprints, which, hey, that's a great philosophy. I think that's awesome to hear that there's plenty of design inspiration in the tank. He also goes on to add, there are some benefits to doing reprints, but one of the downsides is figuring out all the little rules and tech requirements. If they reprint Web Spinner, could you have like 4 Web Spinners in your deck or just 2? Those sorts of things sound like some headaches. So to me, it doesn't sound like reprints are certainly a focus, and new designs are still going to be coming down the pipe for a long time as opposed to harkening back. Now, that said, we do see a lot of cards that are very reminiscent of old cards with very small changes, which isn't the most inspiring design usually, but I do sometimes like when those cards are just reminiscent or nostalgic in a way, but still you get the new artwork, the new name, and it still feels kind of fun and new and exciting. So I'm cool with this. All right, so next up here, a question about achievements and the experience that they grant. So right now there are expansion-based achievements. You finish them, you get a little bit of experience. It turns out when this expansion is over and we get the next rewards track, that the achievements currently granting expansion will no longer, or the achievements currently granting experience will no longer grant experience in the future, which means if you want that XP, you need to finish the achievements before the next expansion Tavern Pass hits. And I'm sure there's some technical reason for this. Like the rewards track is like all baked in and the experience is baked in. But frankly, that's kind of lame. I think they should just always have that experience open to you. What's it really going to hurt to give you that little bit of extra experience? Because it really doesn't add up to all that much. It's just more fun to get the achievements that way. So, yeah, this is lame. I mean, I'm sure there's a reason. Maybe it is just greed. But it feels like there's probably something technical about it. Although, maybe I'm just trying to make excuses. But regardless, this sucks. The achievements should just grant experience forever. Somebody who comes in the game just misses out on those opportunities. They still have those achievements to complete. They may still feel like they have to, but they're not getting the reward, which that's not a great system. So, I am all against this one, unlike everything else so far. Not Dean's fault, I'm sure. Don't hate the messenger on this one from Dean. Like, he's just reporting what is happening, but not an awesome thing. So very quick tease here for some balance in Battlegrounds. Is Khadgar getting deleted soon? Of course, people are very frustrated with Khadgar and Battlegrounds, creating all these crazy golden token turns with Bran and otherwise. And they say they are still exploring some solutions to fixing the Khadgar problem. We'll have more details the next couple weeks. That's awesome. I think the biggest problem with Khadgar is that it encourages people to do the whole like exiting out of Battlegrounds to get the full time on their buy phase instead of in their combat phase, skipping all those animations. Going like outside the client to get a competitive edge is really, really lame. So the fact that Khadgar encourages that is more of a problem to me than the actual skill of like rewarding all those crazy Khadgar pop-off turns. I think it's fine to have really high skill cap stuff in the game, but when it's encouraging people to sort of abuse or, find workarounds to the Hearthstone client, that sucks. So I hope that's where the, solving happens. Like, solutions are easy, just remove Khadgar, right? So if they're searching for solutions, that might mean they're searching more for like the turn timer side of things or the combat phase skip side of things, instead of just like taking Khadgar out of the game or making him tier 5 or whatever they think could fix the Khadgar issues. That's easy. So exploring solutions to me seems to implicate something more, which that's hopefully a good sign that maybe they can retain that skill cap for Khadgar, but also fix some of the workarounds people are using to really abuse it when other people aren't willing to use those same workarounds. So this next one's a pretty crazy update here. Somebody asked, what's the plan for Tavern Brawls? So far this year, there's been a lot of repeats, essentially. I think a big part of that was that Joe Mag, the person who was primarily responsible for Tavern Brawls way back in the day, as far as I know, it like drove the whole thing, did end up leaving Blizzard and moved into a new company. And I don't know if they ever really filled in that spot with somebody who was quite as adept or, prolific, at least with Tavern Brawl design. So I think that's probably why Tavern Brawls kind of had a hiccup. I'm sure that's, getting resolved now. But Dean says the team responsible for Tavern Brawl content is also responsible for Duels, Book of Heroes, and another entirely new game mode we haven't talked about much yet. So it might just be that people are spread pretty thin, because that's a lot of stuff, it feels like. I don't know how big the team is, of course. But all of those things being designed by the same people, and the new game mode we haven't talked about much yet, which is a really weird phrase. I mean, they've teased it. Maybe it just means we haven't teased much, but if they actually talked about it a little, I mean, I don't know what that exactly entails. I haven't heard them talk about any sort of thing. He did talk in a previous AMA about a game mode where he'd want you to get into it quicker, just start playing kind of like Battlegrounds. Maybe that's what he was getting at. But he says Tavern Brawls will probably get more new versions and new experiences once some of those things kind of get wrapped up. So right now, maybe they're more focused on the new game mode. Once that gets settled, then they can move back into Tavern Brawls. If you're looking for fresh Tavern Brawls, just stay tuned until some of these other things actually get released. We also have a bunch of Book of Heroes probably still getting worked on as well. So this is a neat little historical insight into some design stuff. Somebody is basically asking here about cards you thought should change or you wanted to change before the release, and are you happy that you did? And he says Death Knights. They were originally a neutral design that shuffled corrupted things into your deck that turns you into a Death Knight or something until pretty late in the design process. Hard to remember all the details now, aside from the fact that it wasn't fun. And every class turning into a Death Knight felt very similar. We created hero cards in final design, which is really late to be creating a totally new card type from scratch. Turned out to be one of the most polarizing but ultimately positive mechanics we've ever done. Dude, the hype for hero cards in Knights of the Frozen Throne is insane, so I'm sure they really did reap the rewards there, because people loved the idea of hero cards. You can see why some of the balance on them might have been off, because they did it pretty late in the process. I still would love to see like a full set of class hero cards again. I think that's so fun. And then he goes on to talk about more recent designs, that Livewire Lance was 2 mana for a really long time. They knew it was a 10 out of 10 for power level, but they wanted to push the power level a little bit. They changed it to 3 at the last minute, and frankly, at 3 mana, Livewire Lance has still been a fantastic card. So he essentially, I think, thinks this was a good change, because it still ended up in a pretty good spot. But it would have been kind of crazy to see this one at 2 mana, because lackeys, it turns out, were so good and still are so good. So really interesting to hear how some of these things come out at the last second and receive some changes. That's cool. Oh, here he says, turns out it was still quite good at 3, and it would have been a really big balance miss if we hadn't changed it. Yeah, exactly. That's a cool insight. Okay, so this question actually harkens back to one from like 2 weeks ago or a week ago. Somebody asked about Hunter and design thoughts, and essentially Iksar said that on paper, Highlander Hunter has arguably been the best deck in Hearthstone history because it's been tier 1 across 5 different expansions, and it always has been really high up there. So I totally understand this perspective. And essentially, he moves on to say that that has made design a little bit more challenging because anytime you print like just a really strong card that's not a build around, that gets tossed into Highlander and makes it stronger. And that he thinks they missed the mark a little bit on Death Rattle pieces. They tried to get enough for Death Rattle stuff to come together, but it didn't quite get powerful enough to stand out. Whereas if you look at classes beyond Hunter and Rogue, they're a little bit more singular in their design and focused more towards damage, like Warrior and Druid, that they can spread across multiple archetypes much easier, right? So Druid has both like control or ramp Druid and an aggro or token Druid. And Warrior can go aggressive with Pirates, so they can go more towards control. And that Hunter and Rogue don't have such an extreme range, but I guess in the future, maybe they'd like to increase that range a little bit. In the future, I could see us using all these Death Rattle pieces together, create some Death Rattle build-arounds that tie that deck together. Also, it'll be a lot easier to make fun, different, and powerful generic use cards once Highlander rotates. So that's maybe where the floodgates open for Hunter and maybe even Rogue to get some more interesting designs that really change the ways and spread out the ways that you can actually play these classes, which is pretty sweet. I will say Highlander Hunter has been like the go-to Hunter build for so long now. I'll be excited to see it move in a different direction. And then finally, to wrap this sucker up, we got one like extra little note here that was not a part of the AMA, but a quick thought from Alec Dawson on design balance changes for the ramp paladin we talked about this week, the crazy Allura, tip the scale sort of stuff. And that it's currently not being planned to get nerfed, particularly not in the patch that's hitting today or already hit today. Maybe I'm not quite checked that yet. But he says they don't believe in nerfing every flavor of the week deck. That can create an unhealthy environment in itself. We want to promote players finding solutions to deal with the meta how they see fit. If we squash every new deck that comes around, how fun is that? I think that's a reasonable perspective. But he goes on to add, with that being said, Ramp Paladin has a lot of things we don't like. A lot of win rate piled into one card. That's the Allura Spike turn, an early swing turn. Again, that's the Allura Spike turn. So if it proves to be a mainstay, then we'll act accordingly. Deck also rotates out relatively soon. That also factors into those decisions. So it's on the radar. They're just going to see how well it does. If it holds up and remains dominant, then it sounds like it could be a target for a nerf. But for the moment, just a wait and see. So that said, folks, that wraps it up here for the Twitter AMA and my thoughts. I know I don't add a whole lot of substantive insights to these. They're just insightful and interesting on their own, but nonetheless, hopefully you appreciate this chill little way to get a nice recap so you don't have to go read through all of it yourself. That said, I really just want to give you guys a way to discuss all this stuff. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you make of all this? What do you like? What do you hate? Etc. I always enjoy reading your takes. Also, do recognize it's really hard for people like Iksar to step out on Twitter. He gets a lot of hate still. So much love to him for like bravely answering some of these questions. Some are harder than others to answer. Sometimes he says things that he knows we won't like, but he says them anyway. So I respect that. We don't always agree with everything that he has to say. Myself, you as well. But still got to respect the fact that he's out here talking to us and trying to increase communication and offer some pretty interesting insights and teases into the future. So I'm all about these, and I'll keep doing recaps every time there's something interesting to be seen. So thanks much for watching. As always, love you all a ton. And until next time, game on.